red wine arced through the air like a slow-motion bruise, and I knew, in the same instant my stomach dropped, that my life was about to get loud. The bottle had been steady in my hand a heartbeat earlier. Then my heel caught a loose thread in the carpet of the private corridor, and the world tilted. Glass, gravity, and a soundless prayer. The splash landed on a polished black shoe, so expensive it looked unreal, like it belonged in a museum, more than on a man's foot. For half a second, nobody moved. Not the suited men at the table, not the security shadows along the wall, not me, frozen with my wrist still angled mid-pour, feeling every drop hit like a verdict. The man attached to that shoe didn't look down right away. He let the silence expand first, the way people do when they're used to rooms obeying them. I'd seen him twice before from a distance, always behind velvet and money, always surrounded by men who smiled too carefully. Dominic Nico Morelli, 35, Chicago power in a tailored suit. The kind of name managers whispered as a warning, like saying it louder might summon him. Tonight he was here in the Halston Room's private section, where the lighting was softer and the rules were sharper. His head turned slowly, and when his eyes met mine, it felt like stepping onto thin ice. I'm Avery Cole, 28, and I've spent the last 2 years perfecting the art of being unseen. Not because I'm shy, because invisibility is sometimes the only armor a single mom can afford. My son Noah is 6. He thinks my job is glamorous because I come home smelling like expensive food and hotel soap. He doesn't see me counting tips at the kitchen table while he sleeps, doing math that never ends. Rent, daycare, the minimum payment, the next minimum payment. I owe $92,000 in student loans for a degree I barely use. A master's that should have put me in an office with benefits instead of balancing plates near men who carry power like weapons. But the Halston Room isn't just a paycheck. It's a listening post. Chicago's most exclusive restaurant attracts people who don't want to be overheard anywhere else. Politicians, judges, CEOs, and men like Dominic. I took the job because my mother vanished 6 years ago, and the official file went cold fast. Dr. Elaine Cole, linguistics professor, stubborn truth-teller, gone without a body or a goodbye. Every rumor I chased led back to the same kind of rooms, the kind where I'm supposed to be furniture. Behind me, I sensed my manager's panic before I heard it, the way fear has its own temperature. In the private section, silence isn't empty. It's a signal. It tells the staff to disappear, tells the bodyguards to tighten their stance, tells everyone at the table to pretend they're not calculating consequences. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips, feel my face heating with shame, and under it, something older and sharper. I had worked too hard to keep Noah safe to lose everything because of one loose thread. Dominic finally looked down at his shoe, then back up at me, and the expression on his face wasn't anger as much as evaluation. He spoke to the men beside him in a rough old Italian dialect, the kind you don't learn from apps or travel classes. The tone was casual cruelty, the way powerful people entertain themselves when they think the help can't hear. In his words, I was clumsy, replaceable, stupid. He compared me to an animal and laughed softly, like that was the end of it. Except I understood him, every syllable. My mother had insisted I learn dialects, not just languages. She said real power hides in the versions of speech nobody bothers to translate. She used to drill me at night while Noah slept in his crib, making me repeat archaic phrases until my mouth could shape them without thinking. Listening to Dominic, I heard more than insults. I heard names, a shipment, a payoff, a plan that didn't belong on any menu. In that moment I had a choice, and it scared me how clean it was. I could swallow it, apologize in English, and go back to being a shadow. That was the safe option. The mother option. The option that kept paychecks coming and kept Noah safe. But my mother's absence lived in my chest like a splinter. 6 years of unanswered calls, 6 years of imagining Dr. Elaine Cole trapped somewhere, or erased by men who hated questions. And here was Dominic, talking too freely because he thought I was nothing. So I set the bottle down. I lifted my eyes. I answered in his dialect, steady, letting him know I'd understood every insult and every detail he didn't mean to share. Dominic froze. The room's silence turned sharp, and while my manager's footsteps rushed toward me like a sentence, I realized I had traded invisibility for a spotlight owned by Nico Morelli. By the time I slipped back through the velvet curtain, the hallway was holding its breath. No one looked at me. Servers found urgent reasons to polish glassware. The Halston Room didn't tolerate scenes, especially not in the private section where the city's real decisions happened behind soft lighting and harder smiles. My manager came at me like a man trying to outrun disaster. His eyes kept flicking toward the door I'd just come through, as if Nico Morelli might appear and decide the restaurant was guilty by association. He didn't check on me. He didn't ask what I heard. He focused on one thing: damage control. He walked me into the service corridor and ended my job in a few sharp sentences I barely processed until the meaning hit my ribs. I was done. Immediately. The restaurant would protect itself, and I was the easiest shield to throw. I understood the math. A waitress is replaceable. A man like Nico is not. I carried my anger like a hot coin in my mouth. I'd tripped. I'd spilled wine. I'd been insulted in a dialect he assumed I couldn't understand, and I'd refused to swallow it. Part of me wanted to apologize just to rewind time. Another part, the part that has been living on grief for 6 years, wanted to spit fire. They made me clear my locker fast. Apron off, phone charger, my notebook. The snack I kept for the nights I forgot to eat. That notebook wasn't about schedules. It was my private map. Names I overheard, dates I cross-checked, little linguistic tells that hinted at bigger lies. I'd been collecting them because my mother vanished and the official story never added up. Dr. Elaine Cole disappeared 6 years ago. No body, no answers, just a cold file and a life that broke into pieces. I'm 28, raising my son alone, and still paying for the education my mother insisted would protect me. I owe $92,000 in loans, and some days it feels like the debt is the only thing that proves I ever had bigger plans. Outside, Chicago hit me with lake wind and headlights. I walked fast, not to get anywhere, but because I could feel eyes even when none were on me. The city teaches women that. So does grief. And I couldn't stop replaying what I'd heard. Nico's dialect wasn't just cruelty. Buried inside it were details that didn't belong in a dining room. A location, a shipment, a name said like it was dangerous. I didn't know yet if it tied to Elaine, but my body reacted like it did. My mother had trained my ears for exactly this kind of mistake powerful men make when they think you're invisible. My phone buzzed on the corner. Unknown number. I stared at it until the screen dimmed, because answering felt like choosing a future. Then I pictured Noah's 6-year-old sneakers by our door and picked up. The voice was calm, clipped, and unbothered by my fear. He called himself Mason Russo. The way he spoke made his nickname, Mace, feel inevitable. He told me Nico wanted to see me the next morning, around 10 in the morning, and he gave me an address that sounded expensive enough to be private and quiet enough to be lethal. I tried to turn the call into questions, but Mason didn't negotiate. He let silence do what threats didn't need to. Then he said my mother's name like it belonged on his tongue. Elaine Cole wasn't a stranger to them, and in that moment I understood something humiliating and freeing. My invisible routine at the Halston room had never fooled the people who actually watch. I rode the train home with my keys threaded between my fingers and my thoughts racing ahead of me. Every stop felt too slow. Every stranger's glance felt like it lasted a beat too long. My apartment was dim and cramped and safe in the way small spaces can be. I moved straight to Noah's room. He slept with one arm tossed over his blanket, cheek smudged from dinner, breathing steady like the world hadn't changed. I stood there until my throat burned, because the truth was simple. If I disappeared, he'd lose everything. Fear begged me to run, change my number, move cities, start over. But I'd been running for 6 years, and all it bought me was silence. Nico Morelli had heard me speak his dialect. He knew I was dangerous in the only way I'd ever learned to be. I understood. So I sat at my kitchen table, opened my notebook, and wrote down every detail I could remember from the private room, especially the parts that sounded like business. I charged my phone, I checked the lock twice, and I decided that tomorrow, around 10 in the morning, I would walk into Nico's world on purpose. Not because I trusted him, because the truth about my mother was worth more than my comfort, and because staying invisible had never kept me safe. It had only kept me quiet. Around 10 in the morning, River North looked like any other weekday. Dog walkers, delivery vans, the smell of coffee leaking from corner shops. I blended in on purpose, hair pulled back, phone in my hand like I belonged to an ordinary life. Then Nico Morelli's tower rose in front of me, a blade of glass that caught the sun and threw it back like warning. I stopped at the curb and ran my checklist the way I do before parent-teacher meetings and court dates and late shifts. Breathe. Don't beg. Don't rush. Don't flinch. Noah first. Always. If I vanished, he would wake up to strangers. If I folded, my mother would stay a mystery forever. I walked toward the revolving door and let myself feel the question I couldn't answer. Was I here to be recruited, used, or erased, and Noah would pay if I guessed wrong? Inside, the lobby swallowed sound. Marble, dark metal, a scent like citrus and money. A front desk attendant glanced at my face, then at something on a screen, and the air shifted from neutral to prepared. Mason Russo appeared without hurry, tall and neat in a suit that fit like armor. He didn't introduce himself with warmth. He marked me as expected, then turned as if my choice had already been made. I followed because turning around would have been surrender, and because curiosity can be its own kind of courage. We passed a private security door that opened with a silent click. In the elevator, Mason stood angled toward the panel, not toward me, blocking my view of the buttons like a habit. I watched the numbers climb, and felt my heartbeat settle into a steady, practical rhythm. This was how power moved, quiet, efficient, and you would comply. The higher we went, the smaller my old life felt. Somewhere below, school drop-offs were happening, little hands clutching backpacks, parents worrying about lunch money, not whether a billionaire crime broker had decided you were interesting. I thought about Noah's face when he wakes up and looks for me first, the way he calls me mama like it's a spell that keeps monsters out. I also thought about $92,000, the number that sits on my chest when I try to sleep. The Halston room had been my compromise, my secret job for answers, and I'd lost it in one spill. Mason never asked if I was okay. He didn't need to. In his world, feelings were distractions, and fear was assumed. I kept my eyes on the mirrored wall and practiced the expression I use with doctors and landlords. Calm, polite, and unbreakable. The doors opened, quiet. I braced. The penthouse smelled like cedar and clean stone. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the river and the city like trophies, and the furniture looked chosen for intimidation, not comfort. Art hung on the walls, not for beauty, but for proof, rare, old, impossible to touch without permission. Dominic stood near the glass, daylight cutting sharp lines across his suit. In the restaurant, he had felt like a shadow that owned the room. Here, he felt like the architect of it. He turned when Mason delivered me, and I noticed details I hadn't allowed myself to see the night before. The small scar near his eyebrow, the stillness in his hands, the way his gaze measured distance. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The entire space behaved around him, including my body, which wanted to shrink and also, annoyingly, wanted to stare. I forced myself to stand tall. Dominic's attention went straight to what had embarrassed him. The fact that I understood the dialect he thought belonged only to old men and old secrets. His gaze kept weighing me, checking for bluff, for memorized scraps, for a hidden microphone. I didn't bluff. My mother had made language feel like survival. Elaine kept index cards on the kitchen counter beside the cereal box, scribbled with proverbs and regional turns. After Noah fell asleep, she drilled me until my tongue stopped sounding American. She told me powerful men relax when they think you're invisible, and that is when they leak truth. 6 years ago, she followed that truth into places I couldn't go, and she never came back. Since then, every word I learned has been a candle held against the dark. There, it clicked into place. I hadn't learned dialects for conversation. I'd learned them for war with her. Dominic made it clear he knew of Elaine Cole, not as a headline, but as a name filed in his world under risk. Hearing that stole my breath. I wanted to demand everything, but I kept my panic locked behind my teeth. He needed something from me, and that meant I wasn't powerless. His crisis was a missing ledger tied to money trails that had to look clean under scrutiny. Before it disappeared, the man who took it left a message written in archaic dialect proverbs, stacked like stepping stones. Not modern Italian, not a tourist version of anything. Older, rural, thick with cultural shortcuts. Dominic didn't want a dictionary translation. He wanted the intent, the map inside the idioms. As he explained it, I recognized the architecture immediately. It sounded like my mother's methods. The way she hid meaning inside language so only the right ears could unlock it. Then he put money on the table. A cashier's check for $500,000, already made out, like my choice was a formality. My throat tightened, not from greed, but from what that number could do for Noah. It could erase $92,000, keep rent paid, buy breathing room. It could also buy my silence, if I let it. Dominic framed it as a 1-month consulting arrangement, not employment. I would interpret a coded proverb message and help recover the missing ledger. In return, he would open his organization's archives tied to Elaine's disappearance. Not a curated packet, but the trail as it existed. That was the real offer. I answered with conditions. I stayed a consultant. I reported only to him. I got full access and permission to copy. And Noah was untouchable. No contact, no surveillance, No leverage, ever. Dominic agreed fast, and the speed felt like hunger for me. I should have been suspicious of how quickly he accepted my terms. Instead, I felt the ground shift, like my future had been signed without ink. Dominic stepped closer, daylight sharpening the edges of him, and I caught myself noticing the quiet control he carried. I reminded myself why I was here. Truth, and a safer life for Noah. I accepted with the calm of a mother choosing strategy over comfort. When we sealed it, his grip was steady, and the realization landed hard that I was no longer a bystander. I was inside. Mason's presence stayed near the door, watchful and unreadable. Dominic crossed to a wall that looked blank until he triggered a hidden door. Another elevator waited behind it, darker, private, as if the building had a second spine. The penthouse had been the surface. The real world was below. As the doors closed, we started descending. The private elevator doors sealed, and the soft penthouse light vanished like a curtain dropping behind me. Dominic pressed a hidden panel with practiced certainty, then watched the numbers fall past floors nobody names. My stomach rose as we sank, as if Chicago itself was lifting away from my shoes today. I thought about Noah's morning hair, the way he clings when I leave, and I steadied again. Above us were coffee lines and school bells. Below, privacy was engineered, not politely requested by anyone. Mason stood silent at my shoulder, a checkpoint in human form, eyes scanning without emotion at all. The elevator stopped with no chime, only a sigh of air, like the building exhaled for us. A corridor of polished concrete stretched ahead, lit by recessed strips that erased shadows and comfort too. Dominic moved first, and I followed, because refusing now would not rewind what I'd chosen already here. A door opened with biometrics I pretended not to notice, but my mind filed every step quietly. Inside, the war room waited, cold and neat, like a courtroom designed for confessions without judges present. Monitors covered one wall, dozens of feeds blinking over streets, docks, lobbies, and unknown hallways at once. The lighting was surgical, bright enough to expose, soft enough to hide what mattered most to him. A long table sat centered, its surface too clean, its chairs placed like assignments for bad news. I could almost hear my mother's voice saying rooms like this chew up the unprepared for breakfast. Fear sharpened my senses, but it also cleared them, turning panic into a kind of focus fast. Dominic placed a folder beside a laptop, then angled it so I could see handwritten lines plainly. The ink looked rushed, the spacing tight, like someone writing while listening for footsteps outside the door. I read it the way I used to read Elaine's notes, hunting patterns before meaning arrived fully. These were proverbs, but older, regional, and stacked, each one nudging you toward the next on purpose. One compared a wolf to a sheep, which in that dialect signals an insider playing harmless daily. Another warned that night deeds meet daylight, a cultural way of saying the truth leaks eventually anyway. I traced repeated sounds and village phrasing, the small tells academics miss when they chase grammar alone. My first breakthrough hit like a click in my brain, simple once I stopped assuming screens only. A proverb about paper singing and fish staying quiet suggested the ledger had been made physical somehow. People search apartments for drives, but nobody expects a printout hiding inside something boring and heavy nearby. I felt a flicker of satisfaction, not pride, more relief that my mother's training still worked today. Dominic's gaze tightened, the faintest shift, like he'd just seen the room through my eyes for real. I kept going, because stopping would invite fear back, and I couldn't afford that right now either. The next cluster leaned hard on loyalty, blood, and family obligations, which never appear casually in code. In old dialect, family language is a knife, because it shames you into obedience without threats spoken. One line implied betrayal turns blood darker, not water, meaning the danger wears the right name already. I didn't need a roster to feel it. The message was pointing inward, toward Dominic's circle first. My mouth went dry as I realized why a traitor would leave clues instead of vanishing cleanly. Whoever wrote this wanted the truth found, maybe as revenge, maybe as confession, maybe both in death. I pictured Elaine at our kitchen table, tapping a proverb card, telling me to listen deeper always. Dominic stayed still, but the air around him changed, the way weather shifts before a storm hits. Mason's posture hardened near the door, like he'd become a lock, waiting for a command to snap. I forced myself to say the implication plainly, even though it could turn me into a liability. The code wasn't just hiding a ledger. It was warning that the thief had family cover too. That meant Dominic's next enemy might share his blood, his history, or his father's trust still intact. The room felt colder, and I wondered how many betrayals this table had already witnessed in silence. My victory tasted sharp, because solving puzzles is easy compared to surviving what the answers demand later. Dominic's control didn't crack, but it tightened, like a fist closing around something precious and dangerous too. I thought of Noah again, and the promise I'd made to keep their world away from him. Yet here I was, pulling threads that could snap back, and my mother's shadow felt close suddenly. Dominic gestured for me to continue, but his eyes warned that the next name could burn everything. I inhaled, tasted metal from nerves, and followed the proverbs to their next cruel conclusion right away. The betrayer wasn't across the river or outside the city. The betrayer was already at his table. As the monitors hummed, I understood part 5 was coming, and it would ask who Dominic loves most. The monitors kept humming, but nobody moved like before. My last interpretation had landed and stayed there, heavy, turning air into ice. Dominic didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His stillness told me the war room had shifted from puzzle to prey. Mason's eyes flicked to the door, then back to the screens, as if measuring how long it would take for a leak to become a bullet. I swallowed, forced my hands steady over the page, and followed the next proverb cluster, because hesitation is a language predators understand, and I refuse to give them advantage today. Elaine used to say proverbs were the poor man's courtroom. Everybody pretends they're harmless, then they convict you without evidence. These lines were about loyalty, yes, but the old dialect hides pressure inside tenderness. One phrase praised the hand that feeds you, then warned the hand can also close into a fist. Another compared a house key to a wedding ring, the kind of cultural cue that screams access without saying theft. Whoever wrote this wasn't accusing a random soldier. They were pointing at someone with permission, someone who could walk through locked doors and be welcomed like family is. The next set turned darker, all inheritance language and owed respect. In my notes I wrote, entitlement, not hunger. The dialect has a specific bite when someone claims what was promised by blood, and it showed here, wrapped in prayers and old saint references. I watched Dominic's jaw tighten once, just once, and I knew he recognized the scent. A name didn't get spoken, but it appeared in the room anyway, the way a shadow enters before the body. His cousin Vincent, the man who smiles at weddings and counts chairs like votes, as if the family table were a throne. I'd served men like Vincent before, not him specifically, but the type, the one who thinks patience is humiliation and loyalty is a receipt. This wasn't about a missing ledger anymore. It was about succession, about who gets to be called rightful. Dominic's anger didn't flare. It compressed, the kind of fury that makes decisions clean and irreversible. He moved to the monitor wall, and the feeds reflected in his eyes like cold water. Mason started sending silent instructions with his hands, and I understood the hunt had begun while I still held paper and my breath felt too loud. That's when it hit me. I wasn't a consultant in a secure room. I was the key, and keys get stolen. I'd already heard more than insults upstairs, and down here I was hearing structure, names, motives. People disappear for less than this knowledge, and everyone in this room knew it without saying it. My mind leapt straight to my apartment door, the cheap lock, the stairwell that always smells like fried onions, Noah's backpack hanging by the sofa. If someone followed me home, he wouldn't understand why. He would just look for me at pickup and find empty air. I forced myself to speak with my spine, not my panic. Whatever Dominic planned, my son was not a bargaining chip. No watching my kid, no names in files, no surprise visits, no protection that feels like a leash. I laid it out in plain terms, because I've learned that soft requests get ignored. My hands shook, but my voice in my head didn't. I reminded myself that I'd survived 6 years of not knowing where Elaine was. I could survive this too, as long as Noah stayed untouched. If that line broke, I would walk away, money or truth. I expected a fight, at least a power play, something that made me earn the boundary. Instead, Dominic gave ground fast, like the answer had been waiting in him already. It unsettled me more than resistance would have. His control didn't loosen, but it redirected, and for a moment I sensed an instinct older than business, something like guardianship he'd never admit to. Mason looked surprised too, just a flicker, then blank again. Dominic's attention stayed on me, not as furniture, not as hired help, but as someone he had decided mattered to keep alive, and I hated wanting it. The plan shifted immediately. The decoding wasn't a neat academic exercise anymore. It was a race against Vincent, against anyone he'd bought, against time itself. Dominic's people began moving, and I felt the machinery of his world spin up around me. He insisted I stay close enough that his security shadow covered mine, close enough that I could keep reading while he made decisions. It sounded like strategy, but it felt like possession. and that scared me most. If we were leaving this bunker, it meant the next place would be safer, and somehow more intimate. I followed anyway. By the time we slipped out of River North, Chicago had gone back to pretending it was just a city. Commuters on corners. A guy walking his dog like the world was simple. The lake wind pushing at jackets. From street level, Dominic's world was invisible, and I understood the joke of it now. I'd spent years trying to stay unseen. He'd built an entire life that way on purpose. The safe house sat in a quiet row of brownstones that looked expensive but not flashy. The kind of block where people pay for silence. I noticed the protection before I noticed the architecture. A camera that wasn't trying to be cute. A second door that closed a beat too fast. A man on the corner with the posture of someone who never checks his phone. Dominic called it safer, and my body translated that into contained. I kept asking myself the same question as we crossed the threshold. Was I being protected or stored? Inside, everything was warm wood and soft light, but the calm felt engineered. The windows had weight to them, thick enough to dull sound. The locks clicked with that expensive certainty that says money can replace trust. I caught the faint hush of air filtration and realized even breathing had been optimized. Dominic's version of safe wasn't a blanket. It was a system. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt my skin keep listening for the moment the system decided I was the threat it needed to manage. Mason moved through the space like a ghost with a job, checking angles, confirming routines, disappearing to the edges. Dominic stayed at the center without trying. He didn't pace. He didn't perform. He simply occupied the room as if it had been built around him. I forced myself to do the one thing Elaine drilled into me when fear made me sloppy. Inventory. Exits. Sightlines. Objects that could become tools. Then I pulled out my phone and checked for the only update that mattered. The daycare app telling me Noah had eaten his snack and fallen asleep at nap time. My throat loosened for half a second. What threw me wasn't the security. It was what Dominic did once the door sealed behind us. He washed his hands, rolled his sleeves like a man in his own kitchen, and started putting together food with quiet competence. Cutting boards, a pan heating, the kind of simple routine that belongs to normal people. I watched his hands and felt my brain stutter. Those hands signed orders that moved men like chess pieces, and they also knew how to slice onions without rushing. Control looked different when it wasn't aimed at me. It looked almost practiced, like someone had taught him that feeding yourself is its own kind of power. I hated how quickly my body noticed details I didn't want to catalog. The way his shoulders relaxed when he focused on something ordinary. The way he kept his back to the wall anyway, out of habit, like relaxation was a costume he wore with one eye open. I told myself to stay professional, to keep my head in the proverbs, in the missing ledger, in Vincent's shadow. But heat doesn't ask permission. It just exists, and my awareness of Dominic felt like that. Unwanted and undeniable. Elaine would have laughed at me. Not cruelly. Just the way she laughed when she caught me romanticizing danger in my 20s. She always called obsession a velvet trap. I could see her at our tiny kitchen table. Hair in a messy clip. Eyes bright from too little sleep. Pushing a notebook toward me like it was a life raft. She'd make me repeat dialect phrases until my mouth stopped sounding American. Not because she wanted me to impress anyone, but because she believed powerful people speak the truth when they think you can't understand. She disappeared 6 years ago, and the lesson stayed behind like a splinter I could never pull out. In the safe house, with Dominic cooking like a man who belonged to a world that never worried about grocery money, I felt that old splinter twist. I told him, in the only way I could without begging, what my mother's work had done to our lives, how it ate weekends and birthdays, how it turned into late-night phone calls and coded calendars, how it left me with $92,000 of debt, and a 6-year-old who thinks his grandma is a story that ends too soon. I didn't give him a speech. I gave him the truth in small pieces. The way you do when you're afraid the whole truth will break something. Dominic didn't try to comfort me. He didn't soften. But I saw the shift anyway. A tightening behind the eyes. A flicker of recognition that family can be both shelter and weapon. The way he carried his inheritance sat on him like a tailored coat lined with knives. He'd been shaped by loyalty that demanded payment, by a name that never lets you be only a man. I could tell he understood the trap of bloodlines, the way they call it love, while they teach you survival. I reminded him, quietly and firmly, that Noah was off limits in every universe. No watchers, no friendly check-ins, no gifts, no protection that comes with a hook. My son would not become a lever someone could pull. Dominic accepted it with a speed that made my stomach tilt. Not because it was easy, but because it sounded like a rule he wanted to exist. That should have calmed me. Instead, it made me wonder what it meant when a man like that decided your child deserved safety. The breath didn't last. Mason's phone buzzed, and the entire house changed temperature before I even knew why. He read something, looked up, and I saw the message land like a stone. The accountant we'd been chasing through proverbs and coded warnings, Peter Bellini, had been found dead. No details offered, no drama, just the blunt fact that a man who might have explained everything was now silence. My mouth went dry, and my thoughts turned sharp. Dead messengers mean someone is cleaning up. It meant Vincent wasn't only trying to win, he was erasing the path behind him. It meant the ledger might already be moving, or that a decoy was, and either option was a trap. Dominic's focus snapped into place like a lock turning. He ordered old archives brought in immediately, every file tied to Bellini, every record tied to the past, and when he looked at me, I understood what tonight was becoming. We weren't just decoding anymore. We were about to lay my mother's notes beside Dominic's secrets and see where they overlapped. A board of ghosts. A race against a man with our blood in his hands. And a truth that was finally close enough to cut. Just after midnight, the safe house dining table stopped being furniture and started being evidence. Mason cleared the center like he was prepping an operating room, and suddenly my mother's life was spread out under warm lamps. Folders, envelopes, dog-eared notebooks, and printouts that smelled like old toner. Coffee sat in a chipped mug that didn't match anything else. A small reminder that this place still belonged to humans, not only systems. Dominic stayed standing, sleeves rolled, watching the table the way other men watch a street corner. Packets arrived in waves. A man I never learned the name of carried banker boxes up from the basement entry, set them down, and left without a sound. Each box had a coded label, dates and initials in the kind of shorthand people use when they're sure they'll never be questioned. Dominic's internal files were clean, clinical, and heavy with authority. Elaine's notes were the opposite. Ink blots, coffee rings, margins full of arrows, and half-finished thoughts. My own research sat between them. Printouts from public archives, screenshots, the desperate work of a daughter who couldn't afford private answers. We didn't need speeches to agree on the mission. We needed clicks. Proof. A straight line from then to now. I ran my finger down my mother's tight handwriting and tried not to imagine her doing the same thing somewhere else. In some other room, 6 years ago, thinking she was close. I kept hearing a question I'd never dared say out loud. What if Elaine Cole wasn't missing in the way the police file suggested? What if her name had been sitting in Morelli's storage this whole time, filed away like an inconvenience? Around 1 a.m, my eyes started burning, and the lines on the page began to swim. That was when I found it, tucked in the back of Elaine's black notebook, under a section she'd titled simply, Contacts. A date sat beside 2 letters, PB, and a note about a meet in a place she'd described only as the river lot behind the old stone arch. My stomach tightened. PB didn't feel like a random abbreviation. It felt like a door handle turning. I pulled one of Dominic's personnel packets closer, the kind printed on thick paper with a watermark I could see when I held it to the lamp. In the index, Peter Bellini was listed as finance oversight, active, then abruptly reclassified to external contract work right around the same month as my mother's note. A timestamp in the internal log showed an approved after-hours access request under Bellini's credentials, flagged as executive clearance. I didn't have to be a cop to understand what that meant. Elaine hadn't met a stranger. She'd met an inside man. The second click landed harder. Dominic's security archive had a vehicle gate record tied to Bellini. A black sedan logged at the Chicago River Service entrance near the Kinsey Stone Arch, just after midnight. The exact night Elaine wrote her PB entry. There was even a note about a visitor badge issued under a false corporate name, the kind of paper pass my mother would have pocketed and saved. In Elaine's margin, she'd scribbled, "Smells like ink and lilies," which made no sense until I saw the location's nickname in Dominic's file. Lily Gate, the old funeral supply loading dock they'd repurposed years ago. My hands started shaking so badly I had to press my palms flat on the table. The room got loud in that way it does when your ears fill with blood. For years, Elaine's disappearance had been a mystery with soft edges, a missing person case that people could shrug at when their shift ended. This was not soft. This was a collision of names and timestamps and access privileges. This was a trail someone had tried to hide. I thought of Noah in his Spider-Man pajamas, the way he sometimes calls for me in his sleep, and rage rose like bile. Someone stole his grandmother from him. Dominic didn't touch the papers, but I could feel him reading them anyway, absorbing the pattern the way predators smell a wound. His anger earlier had been controlled, the kind that stays useful. This was different. This was personal cold. The kind that comes when you realize betrayal isn't new, it's tradition. I watched his jaw lock, watched the muscle in his cheek jump once, and understood he was tracing these dates backward through generations. If Bellini was the conduit then, someone in Dominic's bloodline had opened the door. Vincent's name didn't need to be spoken for it to poison the air. The logic was brutally simple. Elaine met Bellini under cover of night. Bellini had access that only the inner circle could authorize. After that meeting, her notes got frantic, full of abbreviations and warnings, and then the notebook stopped. No more dates, no more errands written in her neat little boxes, just absence. Bellini's death today didn't erase what he'd been. It only confirmed that whoever used him is still alive and still cleaning. I wasn't chasing a mystery anymore. I was touching the edge of a crime that had been in motion since before Noah was born. I went back to the last line of the coded message, the one that had been nagging at me since the war room. The treasure hides where death gives life. It didn't read like poetry anymore. It read like a map drawn by someone who assumed the reader understood symbolism. Death giving life made me think of the city's old cemeteries, the places where families buy permanence and secrets at the same time. I pictured rows of headstones in Rose Hill, the historic mausoleums like little stone houses, and the caretaker's tunnels underneath, built to keep winter from stopping burials. I couldn't prove it yet, but my gut kept circling that word, life, as if the ledger had been planted near something that literally nourishes growth. Dominic moved the moment he sensed a direction, like action was the only language he trusted. Phones lit up in the room. A team was being pulled from sleep, vehicles staged, routes checked. I heard it in the rhythm of movement, not in words. My fear tried to talk me into staying behind, into letting trained men handle it. But the proverb was layered, and layers change when you stand where they point. I made my decision in one breath. If we were heading to a cemetery, I had to be there, or we'd miss the last clue and walk straight into the trap. By the time we left the brownstone, Chicago felt emptied out, like the city was holding its breath. Dominic's SUV slid through yellow lights, and the skyline kept shrinking in the rear window as we headed north. Mace rode up front, quiet, one hand near the console, eyes scanning every mirror like they were screens. In the back seat, I kept my phone face down on my thigh, forcing myself not to check it every 10 seconds for Noah updates. I told myself I was here because truth costs, but all my body cared about was one simple rule: don't die, or my son loses me too. The cemetery gates appeared like black ribs against the street lamps, ironwork curling into names and crosses that looked sharp enough to cut. Beyond them, headstones rose in uneven rows, and the wind moved through bare trees with a sound like paper being torn slowly. I understood, with a clarity that hurt, that this was exactly the kind of place a proverb would point to, and exactly the kind of place a trap would love. If Vincent had written that last line, he wasn't guiding us to treasure. He was dragging Dominic into the open. 2 cars rolled in, lights off, tires crunching gravel, and the team fanned out with the calm precision of people who practiced worse days for a living. Dominic moved beside me without touching me, close enough that I could feel heat from his coat when the wind shifted. He didn't have to say anything for me to know his plan was simple. Keep me alive, keep me useful. I tried to match their pace, stepping between stones, memorizing angles, looking for the mausoleum that could fit death gives life. The first shot didn't sound like thunder the way movies promise. It was a flat crack that punched the air and made my knees fold. Stone chipped somewhere near my head, and bits of marble stung my cheek like grit. Before I could think, Dominic was over me, his body a shield, his arm hooking across my shoulders and pulling me down behind a thick headstone. My mind flashed, stupidly, to Noah's backpack by our apartment door, and I swallowed panic so hard it burned. The team answered with movement, not noise, sliding into cover, spreading to break the angles that were pinning us. Another shot slapped the earth in front of the gate, and I knew then we hadn't found the clue first. We had been allowed to arrive. Vincent had measured the distance, chosen his perches, and waited for Dominic to walk into the mouth of it. Fear tried to freeze my lungs, but I forced myself to listen, because listening was the only weapon I owned. Mace signaled a retreat toward a stone mausoleum set deeper in the grounds, a squat building with a heavy door and narrow windows like slits. We moved in bursts, crouched low, crossing open paths between headstones while rounds snapped into marble and threw up dust. Dominic kept one hand at my back, guiding me without shoving, and I hated how much my body wanted to trust that pressure. Inside the mausoleum, the air smelled like cold limestone, and the sound changed, turning every shot outside into a distant hammer. That muffled echo gave me space to hear something else. A thread of voices in the old dialect, drifting between trees. confident, organized. They weren't just cheering a kill. They were counting steps, calling positions, and mentioning the kind of blasting powder used to crack stone, not bodies. I felt my mouth go dry as I caught the pattern. A pair circling left to plant something near the side wall. Another pair holding the gate line. A third waiting to rush the door when the boom hit. I pushed the meaning to Mace and Dominic in a rush of breath, not words, letting them know flanking and explosives were seconds away. The response was immediate. Footsteps repositioning. A man peeling off to the left corridor, another aiming at the side window. Dominic shifting me behind a stone column as if he could rewrite physics. A dull thud hit the mausoleum's outer wall, followed by frantic scraping, and then a sharp crack that sounded like a device being crushed before it could wake. Relief flashed through me for half a second, and then fear doubled, because whoever sent that team would send another. Outside, the shooting slowed, not because it was over, but because someone wanted us to listen. A voice carried across the graves, smooth and familiar in cadence, and even without seeing him, I could feel the grin behind it. He used the dialect like perfume, letting it hang in the air, making sure Dominic heard every syllable meant to hook his pride. The message underneath was clear in my bones. Come out, cousin. Come prove you still own the name. Then his tone shifted toward me, and the dialect turned colder, describing me as the stray who learned forbidden words from a woman who asked the wrong questions. When he let Elaine's name slip into that sentence, my blood went to ice, because it wasn't curiosity. It was ownership. He hinted, with the lazy confidence of a man who thinks secrets are inherited, that my mother had been handled the way families handle problems, quietly, permanently, and long before Bellini's body ever hit a file. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper, not from injury but from the urge to scream. Every picture of my mother at our kitchen table, every late-night drill, every promise that language could keep us safe, slammed into me at once. Dominic didn't explode. He went still, the kind of stillness that makes men around him stop breathing, and I understood restraint was the only thing keeping this from becoming a massacre. I leaned close enough to feel the tension in his shoulder and tried to pour control into him with my presence, because Noah needed me alive, and my mother deserved the truth. Footsteps approached through gravel, slow and confident, stopping just outside the mausoleum door as if the night itself had decided to knock. I heard Vincent's intent more than his words, the demand for a face-to-face family reckoning, staged like theater and timed like execution. Dominic's hand went to the latch, and for a heartbeat I thought he might step out alone, the way powerful men sacrifice themselves to keep control of the story. I grabbed his sleeve, not begging, just refusing the idea that my mother's fate could be negotiated without me in the room. The team tightened around us, weapons angled, breath held, and the mausoleum felt smaller than a closet. Somewhere beyond the stone, a branch scraped metal, and the sound made me picture Noah's small fingers tapping my wrist when he wants comfort. I forced air into my lungs and reminded myself that fear is information, and information is what kept us from the explosive that never went off. Vincent waited on the other side, patient, certain Dominic would open the door, and certain I would flinch. Instead, I squared my shoulders, door unlatching. Cold air rushed into the mausoleum when the latch gave. Dominic stepped out first, shoulders squared, settling into that calm stance that made people obey without noise. I stayed at the threshold anyway, close enough to hear, refusing to let my mother's name be traded while I hid behind stone. The cemetery was a geometry problem in marble. Headstones made low walls. A stone angel offered cover to the right. Mace's team held angles in silence, spread wide, half swallowed by darkness. Vincent walked into the open like he owned the space between graves. Even at a distance, I saw the family resemblance. The same sharp bones, the same confidence, but with a smile that never warmed. He used the old dialect again. The tone was familiar on purpose, the way people say cousin when they mean rival and say family when they mean property. Underneath the softness, he pushed one idea at Dominic. The betrayal was necessary. The legacy had to be protected. The old ways were the only ways that worked. Then he pulled my mother into it. Not her whole story, just enough to cut. He referenced Elaine's meeting with Bellini years ago, and the way an outsider with a notebook becomes a threat if she keeps asking. The dialect carried the same ugly verb my mother warned me about. The one that means handled, contained, made quiet. My stomach turned. Grief hit, then anger rose underneath it, clean and usable, because now it wasn't a mystery. It was a decision. For a second I saw Noah's face the way it looks when he's half asleep and reaching for me, and I hated Vincent for making that image feel like a threat. I also hated myself for realizing I was steadying Dominic with my presence, as if my fear could become useful. Vincent kept his gaze on Dominic, but his words were aimed at me too, meant to remind me I was a witness he could erase. That was when I understood this standoff was his audition for power alone. Dominic stayed still, but the stillness sharpened. Vincent kept circling his justification tighter, hinting he had the ledger and could burn Dominic down whenever he chose. He wanted Dominic to beg. He wanted me to break. Instead, I listened for the cracks. The dialect tells the way poker does. A man who truly holds leverage speaks from the chest, not the throat. Vincent performed. He even overpolished a proverb fragment, like he needed witnesses more than truth. In my mother's lessons, that meant bluff. If he had the real ledger, he would be trading it, not risking his life here. I felt my own thoughts snap into a verdict. He was here to take Dominic, not to bargain. I shifted my weight, and Vincent's eyes flicked toward me, irritation flashing as if he could feel what I'd pulled from his language. That fracture was enough. The night snapped open with gunfire, fast and clean, rounds cracking stone, throwing dust, forcing us into motion. Mace's team collapsed Vincent's angles. Vincent's men scattered. Dominic surged sideways at the same time I did, instinct pulling us toward cover. A shot came from the left, aimed at the doorway where I'd been. Dominic crossed in front of me without thinking. I heard a dull impact, saw his shoulder jerk, and my breath vanished. No horror, just the sudden wrongness of his arm not moving the way it should. He didn't fall. He checked that I was still standing, then drove forward with cold efficiency that ended Vincent's threat in seconds. When the shooting stopped, the cemetery went ordinary again. Wind in branches, gravel settling. I was on Dominic before my fear could become a scream. My hands pressed to his coat, finding the warm spot near his upper arm. I forced myself to breathe the way I breathe when Noah has a fever, steady and practical, because panic doesn't stop bleeding. Dominic stayed upright, jaw tight, eyes locked on me for a beat that felt like confession. Then Mace dragged a fallen phone across the gravel and flipped it open. On the screen was a location tag and coded shorthand pointing not to the cemetery, but to a wine inventory code I knew too well. The Halston room, the cellar, the place where my spill made me visible. My chest went hollow. We had been chasing Vincent's noise while the real ledger waited under velvet and crystal, back where everything began. Just before dawn, Chicago looked rinsed and unreal, the streets empty enough that every red light felt like an accusation. Mace drove the lead car and Dominic stayed in the back seat of the second vehicle. One arm held tight against his torso, refusing pain the way he refused weakness. I sat beside him, hands clenched around my phone, watching the Halston room sign appear ahead like a memory I could taste. We were going back to the place that fired me, the place that made me visible, and I kept wondering if someone else had opened the cellar door. Dominic insisted on staying outside the building, close enough to command, but far enough that his injury would not slow the team. Through the tinted glass, he watched the entrance with that predator stillness, while Mace murmured into his headset and shifted men into positions I could not see. I slipped out with a borrowed jacket and a service key card, feeling my old uniform ghosting my skin. The irony hit hard. The spill that ruined my job was also the breadcrumb that led us home. If the ledger was here, it meant the beginning had been staged, not accidental. Inside, the Halston room smelled the same, butter and citrus and expensive perfume, but the air carried fear now, sharp as sanitizer. Staff moved too fast, eyes down, pretending I was another delivery girl, another problem to ignore. I used that. I let my shoulders round and my steps soften, the old survival trick of shrinking until people look through you. In the back hallway, I passed the office where I had been fired, and my stomach tried to fold in on itself, then steadied. Noah needed rent paid, answers found, and a mother who came home breathing at all. The cellar door was where it had always been, tucked behind a linen closet, guarded by nothing but habit and the arrogance of rich people who assume staff are blind. I moved down the narrow stairs, hand sliding along cold rail, listening for footsteps above. Each step brought back that polished shoe, that red splash, the way silence had turned into a weapon. Below, rows of bottles slept behind wire, and I remembered catalog numbers the way other people remember prayers. Somewhere in this room was the proof that ruined lives on purpose. I breathed, counting, pretending fear was math. I found it because my mother taught me to distrust clean surfaces. A vintage wooden case sat too perfect on a lower rack, dustless, label facing outward like a display. When I lifted it, the weight was wrong, heavier than glass, and the bottom sounded dull when my knuckle tapped it. I slid a thin opener under the seam and felt the false panel give. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a ledger thick as a brick, pages packed tight with ink and old stains. My hands went numb as I pulled it free. Above me, place creaked like it knew. The first page wasn't poetry. It was names, dates, routes, money moving in neat columns, and the kind of shorthand that makes accountants dangerous. I flipped to the middle and saw Bellini's initials threaded through older entries, linked to a clinic donation, a storage lease, a phone drop. Then I saw my mother's name, not written in full, just E. Cole beside a meeting code and a checkmark that looked like a sentence ending. My throat tightened. This ledger didn't just explain betrayal now. It proved a network that had swallowed Elaine 6 years ago. Grief became evidence inside me. Mace's team photographed every page, sealed the book, and moved it like it could bite. I carried nothing but the memory of weight, because if someone grabbed me, the ledger still had to survive. Upstairs, the dining room glittered in silence, tables set for a night that would never happen. Outside, Dominic waited in the car, pale under streetlight, his shoulder wrapped and held still. When I placed the sealed package in Mace's hands, Dominic's gaze met mine and didn't slide away. I understood then. He'd chosen me over pride, and I had chosen truth over hiding for Noah's sake. On the ride back, I pressed my palm to the window and let myself think of Elaine without flinching. I remembered her tired smile, the way she drilled that dialect into me like armor, and I finally saw why. She wanted her daughter to survive men who speak in shadows. I wasn't saving her anymore. I was finishing what she started. Dominic's world would bleed out its rot or it would collapse, and he seemed ready to cut deep. My world was sweet. Noah's hair, lunches, and the chance to use $500,000 to erase $92,000. Panic. Build steady ground again. When the noise finally faded, I said goodbye to Elaine in my head, not as surrender but as gratitude. Her notes in this ledger turned 6 years of doubt into proof. I wasn't chasing a myth anymore. I was holding the map of what happened and what must be repaired. I learned a hard lesson. Being invisible keeps you safe until it doesn't. And courage is choosing to be seen anyway. For Noah, for her, for me, I chose truth. If this story moved you, like, share, and comment what you would do here, and whether Dominic deserves a chance. By the time we reached the safe house, it was late enough that the sky looked bruised, not dark. The cars stopped, doors closed, and Chicago kept breathing like nothing happened. Inside, the air smelled of clean wood and coffee that had been reheated too many times. Dominic's shoulder was wrapped and still. His jaw set like pain was a rumor. Mine wasn't. My hands finally shook now that nobody was shooting at marble. I kept thinking, I brought back a ledger, but I still hadn't brought back my mother. The truth I wanted felt enough to cut me open. I checked my phone before I even took my shoes off. One photo from my sitter showed Noah sprawled across his dinosaur sheets, one fist clutching his backpack strap like he might need it in his sleep. Relief hit first, then dread, because relief meant I had space to feel. Elaine had been gone 6 years, and I had spent every one of those years building an invisible life. Work, daycare, debt, silence. $92,000 sat on my shoulders like a second child. Now I was staring at the one answer that could break me. What if truth cost my balance? Dominic didn't circle it. He sat across from me at the table where the ledger lay sealed, and I watched him choose each breath. The confession came in pieces, not drama. The older men who raised him had names for problems like my mother. Elaine Cole was not a missing person to them. She was a risk. When her questions got too close to their channels, an order moved through the family the way blood moves through veins. Erase her completely. Not a headline, not a body. Just absence that teaches everyone else to stop looking. He delivered it steady. My ears rang like I'd stepped too close to a train. Heat climbed my face, then drained, leaving a cold focus that scared me. I remembered Elaine's hands, always smelling faintly of lavender soap and library dust, flipping pages at our kitchen table after midnight. She made me repeat dialect proverbs until my tongue stopped tripping. Not because she loved language, but because she feared what powerful men say when they think nobody understands. Hearing Dominic confirm that fear felt like swallowing ice. I wanted to throw the ledger at him and watch it explode into truth. Right there, screaming. Then he went deeper, and I saw the rot wasn't a single cousin with a gun. It was tradition. The Morelli Empire had been built by men who believed mercy was a flaw you paid for later. Dominic told me he didn't know in real time, not the full plan, not the target's name, only that an old command had been issued and everyone obeyed. He was younger then, still fighting for a seat at their table, still learning which questions got you punished. By the time he learned Elaine's identity, The damage was already history, and history had teeth. He admitted the worst part wasn't the original order. It was his silence afterward. Years later, once he sat high enough to open the old archives, he learned the outline. Elaine followed a money trail into their world. Bellini was the conduit, and the elders decided she couldn't leave with what she knew. Dominic could have dragged that truth into daylight, but daylight would have burned his own house down, and maybe the city with it. He chose survival and stability over confession. That choice kept my mother missing. It kept me grieving, 6 years straight. It landed on me. I stared at him and realized I'd been living inside his silence without knowing it. My chest tightened the way it does before I cry in front of Noah and refuse to. I wanted to label Dominic a coward, the kind of man my mother warned me about. Maybe he was, but his face didn't plead. It carried the tired weight of someone paying interest on a decision. Every day, rage rose anyway, bright and pure. It wasn't only for Elaine. It was for the girl I was when she vanished, and for the woman I became to survive it. In my head, a courtroom opened, and I played every role. Prosecutor, judge, frightened witness. I pictured grabbing the ledger and walking straight to the police, then pictured the firestorm that would follow. Bodies I'd never see, consequences Noah would live with. His little sneakers were by my apartment door in my mind, scuffed at the toes from running too hard. If I chose revenge that got me killed, I would leave him motherless, just like Elaine left me, and I could not repeat that story. Dominic's world had swallowed my mother. I refused to let it swallow my son. Justice, I realized, didn't have to look like blood. It could look like daylight and paperwork and names that can't hide. It could look like Dominic turning his own people over and cutting out the family rot that made disappearance feel normal. The ledger gave us leverage that wasn't a gun. It was proof, and proof is a weapon my mother would have respected. Dominic watched me while I processed that, and I felt him measuring what I would do next. Even with $500,000 waiting, I felt broke, because nothing buys back a mother. It only buys choice for me. I kept asking myself the question that felt like betrayal. Can I love a man whose world swallowed Elaine? I didn't have an answer, only sensations. Dominic held still, letting the confession sit between us like a weight he finally stopped dodging. His control didn't feel like performance. It felt like a brace. He was still dangerous, and he had benefited from an empire built on silence. But for the first time, he chose truth over comfort in front of me. That mattered. Not enough to erase the past. Enough to change what comes next if I stayed and fought. I told him what any future required. Not romance, not promises, just conditions. Truth always, especially about Elaine. No hidden files, no curated access, no selective mercy. And Noah stays untouched. No watchers near his school, no names spoken around him, no men parked outside my building to make me feel owned. If Dominic wanted me beside him, he would dismantle the parts of his world that made my mother disposable. I watched his face as I laid it out. I didn't see bargaining. I saw hard acceptance, the kind that costs pride and forces man to change in public. That was the turning point. Not forgiveness, but direction. The ledger would go to the right hands, and Dominic would stop anyone from burying it again. I imagined a public scholarship in Elaine's name, something clean that couldn't be erased by whispers. I imagined Noah growing up with truth instead of fear, with a home that stayed ours. Dominic's world would not become gentle overnight, and I refused to pretend it would. But it could become accountable. If I stayed, it would be on my terms, with Noah as the North Star, and Elaine's legacy as the map from now. Late that night, I washed my face and watched the water run clear, like I could rinse 6 years away. I couldn't, but I could choose what happens after. Dominic's people moved quietly, shifting from crisis to cleanup, and I listened like a witness instead of a ghost. Tomorrow, in daylight, we would start cutting rot out of his empire and stitching something safer in its place. I would do it for Elaine and for Noah, asleep miles away. I would build a life where my son never learns to disappear. That was my boundary. That was my promise. Forward. 6 weeks after the night we pulled the ledger from the wine case, Chicago went back to pretending it didn't notice blood on marble. People still lined up for brunch, still complained about traffic, still laughed under bright patio heaters. But in the quiet channels where power travels, the air shifted. Dominic's name stopped being a rumor and started being a warning again, not because he got louder, but because he got precise. I felt it in the sudden politeness of strangers, in the way doors opened before I touched them, in how silence followed me like a shadow too. Inside his world, the cleanup looked nothing like the movies. It was spreadsheets, timestamps, controlled meetings in rooms with no windows. Dominic ordered audits that dug through shell companies and consulting invoices the way my mother used to dig through footnotes. The men who couldn't explain their money lost access first, then titles, then protection. Some were pushed toward quiet retirements with strict conditions. Others were handed to lawyers and investigators. Dominic trusted more than family. Mason became the hinge between orders and action, calm as ever, while I watched Dominic choose accountability over comfort. Brutal, necessary, and strangely exhausting. My role changed too. I wasn't wearing an apron anymore, but I also wasn't pretending I belonged in a penthouse. I stayed a consultant on paper and a translator in practice, reading threats before they became gunfire. When a message came in wrapped in old dialect politeness, I could hear the insult underneath. When a partner from overseas used proverb language to test Dominic's spine, I explained the cultural trap and helped him respond without escalating. We built routines, risk briefs, contacts, fewer surprises. I learned violence is often a failure of interpretation, and the cleanest exit is understanding first. Noah stayed the center of every decision, and I enforced that with the kind of firmness only a scared mother can manage. I moved us to a quieter building with a doorman who knew my name, not Dominic's. I walked Noah to school mornings, watching his shoulders bounce under his too big jacket, making sure the same faces were there day after day. Dominic's security never approached him, never waited near the playground, never let their cars idle on our block. Protection, I learned, can be real only when it doesn't announce itself. That was my rule, and Dominic kept it. The money didn't rescue me the way people imagine money rescues women. It didn't erase the nights I cried quietly in the bathroom so Noah wouldn't hear. But it gave me air. I paid down the $92,000 like it was a monster I'd been feeding for years, and I set up a cushion that meant one broken tooth or one missed shift wouldn't destroy us. I kept working too, because pride matters when you have a kid watching. Dominic never tried to buy my obedience. If anything, he learned that my yes only comes with clear terms every single time. Dominic's pivot wasn't a press conference. It was paperwork and decisions that still hurt people who deserved it. He shut down routes built on intimidation and replaced them with legitimate logistics contracts, hospitality investments, and real estate that could survive sunlight. He folded smaller crews into one compliant structure and hired outside accountants who did not flinch at threats. The old guard hated it. The loyalists adapted. I watched Dominic sign documents that cut his own income for a while in exchange for stability, and for the first time, I believed his redemption had teeth, even without anyone clapping nearby. Elaine's name became something other than a missing poster. With the ledger's proof and Dominic's money routed into clean channels, we created the Elaine Cole Foundation with bylaws and oversight, not a vanity headline. Dominic funded it with a $5 million endowment that could not be pulled back, and I insisted on a board that included educators, single parents, and a retired investigator who asked questions. The foundation pays tuition for single-parent students studying journalism, languages, or public records research, and it covers childcare stipends, so ambition doesn't die in the daycare line. That detail mattered to me more than gala. The first letter we received wasn't fancy. It was an email from a woman in her 30s who had 2 kids and a voice that sounded like mine used to. Exhausted, smart, invisible. She wrote that she could finally take the night classes she'd postponed for 4 years, because someone would pay for childcare and train fare. I cried over my coffee, right there in the kitchen, and Noah asked if I was sick. I told him I was fine and meant it. For the first time, grief did something besides hurt. It built, and it felt like her smile. Dominic didn't suddenly become normal. He still scanned rooms without thinking, still sat where he could see exits, still moved like the world was a negotiation. But he tried, in small ways that mattered more than grand gestures. One quiet morning, he stood in my kitchen and wrestled with a lunchbox lid, while Noah hopped around his ankles asking for extra strawberries. Dominic listened, then washed the berries carefully, like the act had rules. Later, he showed up with a paper bag from a neighborhood bakery, cinnamon rolls still warm. Watching him learn softness without performing it made me hopeful. Love, if that's what this was, came with paperwork in my head. I didn't give Dominic my heart like a surrender flag. I gave him access in measured doses, the way I gave him access to my son's schedule. Carefully, with limits, and only after he proved he could respect them. He never slept at my place when Noah was home. He never introduced himself as anything but a friend I trusted. He accepted that I would always choose Noah first, even if it bruised his pride. In return, he offered consistency. For me, consistency felt like romance at last. Some nights I still woke up hearing Elaine's voice, the way she said my name when she wanted my attention. I kept one of her notebooks in my bedside drawer, not for clues anymore, but as proof she existed. When Dominic's world pressed in, I used what she taught me to keep it from spilling over. I translated tense meetings into outcomes. I flagged a phrase that sounded respectful but meant revenge, and Dominic rerouted a deal before it turned into another cemetery. Each time we avoided violence, I felt like I honored her in the language that mattered: action. There were consequences no endowment could soften. People who lived off the old darkness didn't applaud our clean turn, and Dominic didn't ask them to. He sold a club that drew trouble, closed a cash business that never made sense, and walked away from partnerships that required fear as currency. He met with the worst actors in daylight and made it clear they were finished. When one tried to test him with loyalty language, he answered with contracts and court dates. It wasn't mercy. It was an exit strategy. The victory was beating them without becoming them for Noah's future. I think about the dialect now, not as a secret code, but as a reminder of who gets underestimated. Elaine taught me people reveal themselves when they believe you are small. I built an invisible life to survive, but visibility changed the story. I didn't win because I became fearless. I won because I stayed afraid and still showed up when it counted, then still showed up the next morning at my son's classroom door. Courage isn't loud. Sometimes it's a woman holding her ground while the world tries to translate her into silence and refusing to apologize for it. If you had told me a spilled glass of red wine would lead me here, I would have laughed through tears. Truth doesn't arrive politely. It kicks the door in, then asks what you will build with the wreckage. I built a safer home for Noah, a foundation that carries my mother's name, and a future with Dominic that only works because it stays honest. I'm still learning how to rest. If this story stayed with you, please like, share, and comment one thing. Would you walk into the lion's den for the truth, and what boundaries would you keep? One quiet Saturday morning, I realized fear wasn't the first thing I tasted anymore. It used to be coffee and panic, checking locks, checking my phone, checking the hallway before I stepped out. Now it was just cinnamon and dish soap. Noah's cereal bowl clinking against the counter, his 6-year-old voice humming while he tried to lace up soccer cleats that never cooperate. His backpack waited by the door like a promise that Monday would arrive and we'd be ready for it. Dominic didn't live in my home, not in the way people imagine. He stayed in the background on purpose, like a shadow that chose to be gentle. Some days he picked us up from practice from a respectful distance. Sometimes he sent a driver for groceries and stayed out of sight. The rules were simple because my heart needed them simple. Truth as the price of closeness, and Noah as the non-negotiable center. Dominic kept his world away from my child, and he kept his hands open instead of possessive. Consistency became the most romantic thing he could offer. The day Elaine's name finally felt like daylight, it wasn't in a courtroom or a newspaper. It was in a folding chair ceremony at a community college auditorium that smelled like old wood and fresh flowers. A student I'd never met stood at the front, shaking, holding a letter that meant tuition paid and childcare covered. I watched her blink like she couldn't believe the numbers were real, like she'd been bracing for rejection the same way I used to brace for overdue notices. And when she smiled, it hit me that my mother's work hadn't ended in silence. It had moved forward, through someone else's life. I still miss Elaine in the small places. In the way I reach for my phone to tell her something, and remember I can't. In the way certain words in that old dialect still feel like her hand on the back of my neck, guiding my attention toward what matters. She taught me language as a weapon, but what she really taught me was attention. Listen closer. Notice patterns. Don't let powerful people assume you are too tired or too broke or too young to understand them. That lesson started with a spill. A glass tipping, red wine arcing through air, my body bracing for punishment before it even landed. I thought that moment ruined me. I thought it cost me my job, my cover, my fragile invisibility. Now I see it as the doorway that forced me to stop shrinking. The Halston room made me feel like a ghost, but the dialect made me visible in a way the world couldn't ignore. I didn't become safe by hiding. I became safe by speaking, then building boundaries strong enough to hold the truth. I won't pretend everything is perfect. Dominic is still Dominic. His name still carries weight that can bend a room. And there are days I feel the old darkness tug at the edges of our life. But he is choosing, over and over, to cut the rot instead of feeding it. And I am choosing, over and over, to be a mother first, a woman with standards, and a daughter who refuses to let her mother's story be reduced to a missing person headline. Some nights Noah falls asleep with a library book on his chest, and I watch his lashes flutter while the city hums outside. That quiet is my victory, and my mother's too. Finally. If you stayed with me through all of this, thank you. If my story made you feel something, I'd love it if you liked this video, shared it with someone who needs hope, and left a comment. Would you have walked into the lion's den for the truth? And what boundary would you set to protect your child and your heart? Final no next transition.